Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown fought to keep his B-17 Flying Fortress Ye Old Pub in the air as the bomber staggered toward the North Sea. Around him, the aircraft was disintegrating. The entire tail section had been shot away, exposing the tail gunner's position to the freezing air at altitude. The number 2 engine was destroyed, trailing smoke. The number 4 engine was running rough and threatening to quit. Hydraulics were gone. Oxygen system destroyed. And half his crew was dead or wounded. What Brown didn't know yet was that a German Bf-109 fighter had pulled alongside his crippled bomber, not to deliver the killing shot, but to escort him to safety. In the cockpit of that German fighter sat Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a decorated Luftwaffe ace with 27 confirmed kills, who had just made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. Stigler was close enough to see the devastation inside the American bomber, the blood frozen on the fuselage walls, the wounded gunner slumped in his position, the desperate pilot fighting controls that barely responded. He could have shot the B-17 down with a single burst. His guns were loaded. His orders were clear: destroy enemy bombers by any means necessary. One more kill would bring him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. Instead, Stigler flew alongside the dying bomber, waggling his wings in the internationally recognized signal, "Follow me." He would escort the enemy aircraft to the coast, protecting it from German fighters and anti-aircraft fire, risking court-martial and execution for what the Luftwaffe would consider treason. The decision would cost him the Knight's Cross he had fought years to earn. But 47 years later, when these two men finally met, Stigler would tell Brown, "I could not kill them. It would have been like shooting a man in a parachute." The story of how a German fighter pilot became guardian angel to an American bomber crew is a story about humanity surviving in the midst of total war, about the unwritten rules that warriors across cultures have recognized for centuries, and about a debt that took nearly half a century to repay but was never forgotten. The pilot, Franz Stigler's War. Franz Stigler was born on August 21, 1915, in Regensburg, Bavaria. He grew up in a Germany devastated by World War I's aftermath, where economic collapse and national humiliation created the conditions that would eventually produce the Nazi regime. But Stigler's path to the Luftwaffe was driven by passion for flying rather than political ideology. Stigler learned to fly as a young man in the 1930s, when Germany was covertly rebuilding its air force in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. He became a civilian flight instructor before the war, teaching aspiring pilots in gliders and light aircraft. When war came in 1939, Stigler was conscripted into the Luftwaffe, where his flying skills and instructor experience led to assignment as a fighter pilot. By December 1943, Stigler had been flying combat missions for over 3 years. He had fought in North Africa under the legendary Hans-Joachim Marseille, one of Germany's greatest aces, who became Stigler's mentor and friend. Marseille was killed in September 1942 when his Bf-109 suffered mechanical failure and he was struck by the aircraft's tail during a bailout. Stigler witnessed the death and was profoundly affected by losing both a friend and the pilot he most admired. Stigler had been shot down multiple times, wounded, and had watched countless friends die in combat. He had accumulated 27 confirmed aerial victories, enough to make him a successful ace, but not yet enough to earn the Knight's Cross that required 30 victories for fighter pilots in 1943. 3 more kills would earn him Germany's highest military honor, recognition that every fighter pilot dreamed of achieving. But Stigler had also absorbed lessons about honor and combat from his mentors, particularly Gustav Rödel, a highly decorated fighter pilot who had told him, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." This statement, made half seriously but representing a deeply held principle about honorable combat, would echo in Stigler's mind on December 20th, 1943. The code among fighter pilots, both Allied and Axis, included certain unwritten rules. You didn't shoot pilots in parachutes. You didn't strafe lifeboats or clearly marked rescue vessels. And while the rules were frequently violated by both sides, particularly as the war grew more desperate and brutal, some pilots still held to these principles as the last remnants of honor in industrial warfare. Stigler was stationed at Yevor Airfield in northern Germany in December 1943, flying defense missions against the massive American bomber formations that were systematically destroying German cities and industry. The missions were dangerous and exhausting. American bombers flew in tight formations, their combined defensive firepower creating overlapping fields of fire that made attacking them costly. German fighter pilots were suffering unsustainable casualty rates, but orders were clear. The bombers must be stopped regardless of cost. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, Stigler had already flown one mission earlier in the day, engaging American bombers during their raid on Bremen. He had expended most of his ammunition and was low on fuel when he landed back at Yevor to rearm and refuel. The airfield was a scene of organized chaos, damaged fighters being repaired, pilots being debriefed, ground crews working frantically to turn around aircraft for the next wave of attacks. Stigler was preparing for a second mission when the alert came. More American bombers were in the area, stragglers separated from the main formations, vulnerable and alone. These stragglers were priority targets. Damaged bombers limping home without the protection of formation defensive fire could be shot down by single fighters. Every fighter pilot was ordered to scramble and hunt for stragglers. Stigler climbed back into his Bf-109G6, a version of the legendary German fighter that had been refined over years of combat. The Bf-109 was armed with one 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns mounted above the engine. It was fast, maneuverable, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, deadly against bombers. Stigler took off from Yevor, climbing rapidly while scanning the skies for targets. What he found would force him to make the most difficult decision of his combat career. The bomber, Ye Old Pub, over Bremen. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown was 21 years old, flying his first combat mission as aircraft commander. His B-17F Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was assigned to the 379 Bombardment Group 527 Squadron operating from Kimbolton, England. Brown was the pilot, responsible for 10 men whose lives depended on his decisions and flying skill. The mission on December 20th, 1943 was targeting industrial facilities in Bremen, a port city in northern Germany and a major industrial center. The 379th Bombardment Group was part of a larger formation of over 350 bombers, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The plan was straightforward: fly to Bremen in tight formation, bomb the target, and return to England before German fighters could inflict catastrophic losses. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. As the formations approached Bremen, German fighters attacked in waves. Bf-109S and FW-19OS bore in from head-on, the closing speed approaching 500 miles per hour, giving gunners only seconds to track and fire before the fighters flashed past or broke away. The bomber formations were disrupted by the ferocity of the attacks. Several B-17s were hit and fell out of formation, trailing smoke and flames. Ye Old Pub was hit multiple times during the run to the target. German 20mm cannon fire punched holes through the wings and fuselage. The No. 2 engine was hit and had to be feathered, shut down with the propeller blades turned edge-on to reduce drag. The tail section took multiple hits, and the tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was seriously wounded by shell fragments. But Brown pressed on to the target. Turning back would mean the mission was wasted, and his crew's efforts were for nothing. The bomber formation dropped its bombs on Bremen through heavy anti-aircraft fire, then turned for home. This was when Ye Olde Pub's situation deteriorated from serious to desperate. As the formation turned away from Bremen, Bf-109S attacked again. This time, Ye Olde Pub was hit even harder. A 20-millimeter shell exploded in the nose section, seriously wounding the navigator, Second Lieutenant Al Sadok. The bombardier was hit by fragments. In the radio room, Staff Sergeant Richard Pechout took shrapnel wounds. The oxygen system was destroyed, and at 27,000 feet, oxygen deprivation would kill the crew in minutes. Brown had no choice. He pushed the bomber's nose down, diving toward lower altitude where the crew could breathe without supplemental oxygen. The B-17 screamed downward, airspeed building past safe limits, the airframe shaking violently. Brown pulled out of the dive at about 12,000 feet, but the violent maneuver had cost them their place in the formation. They were alone, separated from the protective firepower of other bombers, limping toward the North Sea with multiple systems damaged or destroyed. Then the fighter attacks resumed. German Bf-10-9s and FW-19s hunting for exactly this kind of vulnerable straggler, found Ye Olde Pub and attacked repeatedly. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Samuel Blackford, fought back with his twin .50 caliber guns, but the defensive fire from a single damaged bomber was insufficient to drive off multiple determined fighters. The attacks were devastating. The number 4 engine was hit and began running rough. The hydraulic system was destroyed, meaning the landing gear couldn't be lowered and the turrets couldn't be powered. The electrical system was damaged. Instruments were shot out. And most horrifically, the entire plexiglass nose section was shattered, exposing the navigator and bombardier to the minus 40-degree wind at altitude. The tail section was hit so badly that the entire structure was in danger of separating from the aircraft. The rudder controls were barely functional. The elevators were damaged. Brown was fighting the control yoke with all his strength just to keep the aircraft level. The bomber was flying more through force of will than aerodynamics. Inside the aircraft, conditions were nightmarish. The temperature was far below freezing. Wind roared through dozens of holes in the fuselage. Blood from wounded crew members had frozen on the walls and equipment. Several crew members were unconscious or in shock from wounds. The intercom system was damaged, making communication between positions nearly impossible. Brown knew they were dying. The aircraft couldn't reach England in its current condition. The North Sea crossing, normally a 40-minute flight, was now impossible. They would have to crash land in Germany or attempt to reach neutral Sweden. Either way, their chances of survival were minimal. Then Brown looked out his left window and nearly had a heart attack. A German Bf-109 fighter had pulled alongside, close enough that Brown could see the pilot's face. The German fighter was in perfect shooting position. All he had to do was bank slightly, open fire, and Ye Olde Pub would be finished. Brown waited for the killing burst that would end everything. Instead, the German pilot just flew there, looking at the bomber, and what Franz Stigler saw through the shot-out nose of the B-17 would change both their lives forever. The decision, when honor overrode orders. Franz Stigler had spotted the lone B-17 at approximately 12,000 feet, struggling to stay airborne, clearly badly damaged. This was exactly what he had been sent to find, an isolated, crippled bomber that he could shoot down easily. One more kill toward the Knight's Cross. Stigler maneuvered his Bf-109 into attack position, approaching from behind and slightly below where the bomber's defensive guns had limited fields of fire. He armed his weapons and prepared to fire. Then he saw the tail gunner's position. The tail was shot to pieces. The plexiglass was shattered, and slumped in the position, clearly wounded or dead, was the tail gunner. Stigler flew closer, moving alongside the bomber to assess the damage. What he saw shocked him even by the brutal standards of aerial combat he had experienced. The entire aircraft was riddled with holes. One engine was destroyed, another trailing smoke. The tail section looked ready to separate from the aircraft. Through the holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see wounded men inside. The navigator was collapsed in the nose section, blood frozen on his flight suit. Other crew members were slumped at their positions. Most shocking was the pilot. Through the cockpit window, Stigler could see Charlie Brown fighting the controls, his face showing the exhaustion and desperation of a man at the absolute limit of his endurance. The co-pilot was helping, both men using all their strength to keep the bomber flying. In that moment, Stigler saw not an enemy bomber but a crew of young men who had been through hell and were trying desperately to get home. They were no longer combatants. They were victims, flying in an aircraft so damaged it was barely airborne, defenseless and defeated. The words of Gustav Rudel came back to him. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." This bomber was effectively a parachute. Its crew were helpless, unable to fight back, just trying to survive. Shooting them now would be murder, not combat. But Stigler's orders were explicit. Destroy enemy bombers. Every bomber that made it back to England would return to bomb Germany again. Every enemy aircrew that survived would fly more missions, killing more Germans. Military logic was clear. These men were enemies who needed to be destroyed. Stigler struggled with the decision for seconds that felt like hours. His training, his orders, his duty to Germany all demanded that he shoot down this bomber. But his personal code of honor, the principles he had absorbed from his mentors, and his own sense of what was right in the midst of this brutal war pushed him toward a different choice. He thought of Hans-Joachim Marseille, his friend and mentor, who had died in a mechanical accident. He thought of all the friends he had lost, all the young men who would never go home, and he thought about what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of warrior he could live with being after the war ended. Franz Stigler made his decision. He would not shoot down the bomber. Instead, he would escort it to safety. The escort flying through enemy territory. Stigler pulled his Bf-109 alongside the B-17, close enough that Charlie Brown could clearly see him. Brown's reaction was shock and terror. The German fighter was in perfect shooting position, and Brown had no defense. His gunners were dead, wounded, or unable to reach their guns due to equipment damage. All he could do was wait for the attack. Instead, Stigler made eye contact with Brown and pointed, first at the bomber, then toward the North Sea. The gesture was clear. "Follow me." Stigler was telling Brown to fly toward the coast, toward safety. Brown couldn't believe what he was seeing. A German fighter pilot was trying to help them. Stigler flew a lazy S pattern ahead of the bomber, deliberately flying slowly so the damaged B-17 could keep up. He was making himself vulnerable by flying so slow and predictably, but he wanted Brown to understand that he was not attacking but escorting. Brown, still struggling with the controls and trying to process what was happening, followed. He had no better options. The bomber couldn't make it to England. Their only hope was to follow this German pilot and see where he led them. As they flew northwest toward the coast, Stigler positioned himself between the B-17 and German anti-aircraft positions on the ground. German flak batteries, seeing a Bf-109 flying in formation with a B-17, held their fire. They assumed the fighter pilot had some plan to force the bomber down or escort it to an airfield for capture. This was exactly what Stigler wanted them to think. They also flew past German airfields where other fighters could have taken off to attack the bomber. Stigler stayed close, his presence serving as a protective shield. Any German pilot seeing them would assume Stigler was handling the situation. The escort continued for approximately 30 minutes, an eternity in combat conditions where every second meant discovery and possible attack. Brown, in the cockpit of the dying bomber, still couldn't comprehend what was happening. His training, his briefings, everything he knew about the enemy said this was impossible. German fighters didn't escort American bombers to safety, they shot them down, yet this was clearly happening. The German pilot was protecting them. Stigler was taking enormous risks. If other German pilots recognized what he was doing, escorting an enemy bomber to freedom, he could be shot down by his own side. If he was observed and reported, he would face court-martial for treason and likely execution. The penalty for aiding the enemy during wartime was death, and there would be no mercy for a Luftwaffe pilot who deliberately allowed enemy bombers to escape. But Stigler had committed to his decision. He would see this through to the end, whatever the consequences. These American airmen would live, would go home, would have futures. That was more important than the Knight's Cross, more important than orders, maybe even more important than his own survival. As they approached the North Sea coast, Stigler faced a critical moment. Once they crossed the coastline, they would be over water, Allied territory where RAF fighters patrolled. If Stigler crossed with them, he would be vulnerable to Allied attack. But if he turned back too soon, German coastal batteries might shoot down the bomber. Stigler solved the problem by escorting Ye Old Pub to the coastline, then pulling alongside one final time. He looked directly at Charlie Brown, made eye contact, and saluted, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another, acknowledgement that they had shared something profound. Then Stigler banked away, turning back toward Germany, leaving the crippled B-17 to cross the North Sea alone. Brown watched the German fighter disappear, still unable to fully process what had just happened. The enemy who should have killed them had instead saved them, and Brown had no idea who he was, no way to thank him, no way to repay the debt. The aftermath, silence, and survival. Charlie Brown managed to nurse Ye Old Pub across the North Sea, though he later said he had no memory of much of the flight. The aircraft was on autopilot, but the autopilot was damaged, requiring constant corrections. His crew helped as much as they could, but several were wounded and all were exhausted. They made an emergency landing at Seething, an RAF base on the English coast, rather than attempting to reach their home base at Kimbolton. The B-17 touched down with no hydraulics, no brakes, and barely enough control to keep the wings level. It rolled to a stop on the grass beside the runway, and the crew evacuated immediately, certain the aircraft might collapse or catch fire at any moment. Ground crews and mechanics who examined Ye Olde Pub after landing were shocked the aircraft had stayed airborne. They counted over 400 bullet and shell holes in the fuselage and wings. The tail section was barely attached. 3 engines were damaged. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The oxygen system was destroyed. Instruments and controls throughout the aircraft were shot out or damaged. One mechanic famously said, "I don't know how this thing stayed in the air. The laws of physics say it should have fallen apart." Another said it was the worst combat damage he had ever seen on an aircraft that successfully returned to base. Brown's crew received medical treatment for their wounds. The tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, survived despite serious injuries. The navigator, Al Sadak, recovered from his wounds. All 10 men aboard Ye Old Pub survived, though several carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. But Brown made a decision that would shape the next 47 years of his life. He told no one about the German pilot who had escorted them. When he was debriefed by intelligence officers, he omitted the entire encounter. He told his crew to say nothing about it. They would report that they had been attacked by fighters, that they had sustained heavy damage, that they had made it back through luck and determination. But nothing about the German escort. Why the silence? Brown later explained that he feared consequences if he told the truth. In December 1943, the war was far from over. Allied intelligence officers might not believe his story. It sounded too fantastic, too much like propaganda or delusion. And if they did believe it, there might be accusations that Brown had collaborated with the enemy, or that he had failed to shoot down a German fighter when he had the opportunity, though Brown had no functioning weapons. More practically, Brown knew that reports of a German pilot aiding Americans might provoke retaliation. If the story became public, the Luftwaffe might punish that pilot if his identity were discovered. Brown felt he owed the German pilot his silence. The man had saved their lives at great personal risk, and the least Brown could do was not endanger him further. So Ye Old Pub's crew kept the secret. They told no one about the German escort. The story became something they shared among themselves but never discussed publicly. And as years passed and the war ended, the memory might have faded into just another wartime story, extraordinary but unverifiable, known only to the men who had experienced it. Except Charlie Brown never forgot. The image of that German pilot flying alongside their dying bomber, refusing to deliver the killing shot, stayed with Brown for the rest of his life. He felt he owed a debt that could never be repaid. The German pilot had given Brown and his crew their futures, their children, grandchildren, all the years they would live. All of it was a gift from an enemy pilot whose name Brown didn't even know. Franz Stigler's war ends. Franz Stigler returned to Yevor Airfield after his encounter with Ye Old Pub, landed and said nothing about what had happened. He filed no report about escorting an enemy bomber. He claimed no victory. He told no one that he had violated orders and potentially committed treason under German military law. Stigler later said he spent the rest of that day expecting to be arrested. German radar had tracked the bomber. Ground observers had seen him flying alongside it. Someone must have reported the strange sight of a Bf-109 escorting a B-17 toward the coast. He waited for the Gestapo to arrive, for the accusations, for the court-martial. Nothing happened. Either no one had made a formal report, or the chaos of the air battles that day meant one strange incident among hundreds went unnoticed. Stigler had escaped consequences for his decision, but the decision itself haunted him. He had chosen honor over duty, humanity over orders. He had saved 10 enemy airmen who would likely return to bomb Germany again. He had potentially extended the war by some infinitesimal amount by allowing that bomber to escape. But he had also proven to himself that he was still human, still capable of mercy, still able to make moral choices in the midst of a war that demanded brutality. In the months and years that followed, as Germany's situation became increasingly desperate and the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Stigler held on to that decision as evidence that he had retained his humanity. Stigler survived the war. He was shot down multiple times, wounded, but always managed to return to service. By war's end, his confirmed kill total was 28, 2 more than he had when he encountered Ye Old Pub, but still short of the 30 required for the Knight's Cross. He would never receive Germany's highest military honor, partly because he never achieved the required kills, but also because allowing an enemy bomber to escape meant he had failed in his primary mission, to destroy as many enemy aircraft as possible. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Stigler faced an uncertain future like millions of other German servicemen. His home city of Regensburg was in ruins from Allied bombing. The Germany he had known no longer existed. His military service, instead of bringing honor, now brought shame and suspicion in the occupation environment where former Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe personnel were viewed with hostility. Stigler eventually immigrated to Canada in the early 1950s, seeking a fresh start away from the devastation of post-war Germany. He settled in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he started a successful business as a commercial pilot and flight instructor. He married, raised a family, and built a new life in Canada, rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. But like Charlie Brown, Franz Stigler never forgot December 20th, 1943. The image of that dying bomber, the young pilot fighting his controls, the wounded crew members visible through the shot-up fuselage, it stayed with him. He wondered sometimes if they had made it. He hoped they had survived, but he had no way to know, no way to find out what happened after he turned back toward Germany. For 47 years, neither man knew if the other had survived the war. Their lives proceeded on separate continents, Brown in the United States, Stigler in Canada, each carrying the memory of that extraordinary encounter, but believing they would never see each other again. Then, in 1990, something changed. Charlie Brown decided it was time to find the German pilot who had saved his life. The Search, 47 years later. In 1990, Charlie Brown was 68 years old, retired, and haunted by a debt he had carried for nearly half a century. He had lived a full life, married, raised children, built a career, but he had never forgotten the German pilot. As he grew older and began thinking about mortality, Brown became increasingly determined to find the man who had saved him and his crew, to thank him personally, and to tell the world about an act of mercy in the midst of total war. But how do you find someone when you don't know their name, their unit, or even if they survived? Brown knew only that the pilot had been flying a Bf-109, had encountered them near Bremen on December 20th, 1943, and had escorted them to the coast. That was everything. It seemed like an impossible search. Brown began by contacting veterans organizations, writing letters to former Luftwaffe pilots, and advertising in military history publications. He described the encounter, provided the date and location, and asked if anyone knew of a German pilot who had escorted a B-17 to safety. Most responses were skeptical. The story sounded too extraordinary to be true. Some suggested Brown had imagined or misremembered the encounter. Others suggested the German pilot had perhaps intended to force the bomber down to capture it rather than save it. But Brown persisted. He knew what had happened. His crew remembered it. The German pilot had deliberately saved them, and Brown was determined to find him. The search continued for months without success. Brown was beginning to lose hope when he received a letter that changed everything. Franz Stigler, reading a letter Brown had published in a veterans newsletter, recognized the description immediately. The date, the location, the type of aircraft, the escort to the coast. It was his encounter, his decision, his secret. After 47 years of silence, Stigler finally had the opportunity to know what happened to the bomber he had escorted. Stigler wrote to Brown, carefully describing the encounter from his perspective, how he had found the damaged B-17, how he had seen the wounded crew, how he had made the decision not to shoot, how he had escorted them to the coast. He provided details that only someone who had been there could know: the specific damage to the bomber, the tail gunner slumped in his position, the pilot fighting the controls. When Brown received Stigler's letter, he wept. For 47 years, he had wondered if the German pilot survived. Now he knew. The man who had saved his life was alive, living in Canada, and had finally responded to Brown's search. They arranged to meet in person. In 1990, at a hotel in Seattle, Washington, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler met face-to-face for the first time since December 20th, 1943. Brown was 68. Stigler was 75. They embraced like brothers, both men crying, overwhelmed by emotion. Through translators and with considerable effort given Stigler's limited English, they recounted the encounter from their different perspectives. Brown described the terror of seeing the Bf-109 pull alongside, the confusion when Stigler didn't shoot, the desperate flight across the North Sea. Stigler described his internal struggle, his decision to save them, his fear of consequences. Brown thanked Stigler repeatedly, trying to express gratitude that words couldn't adequately capture. Stigler insisted he had done nothing special. He had simply done what his conscience demanded. But Brown knew better. Stigler had saved 10 men's lives at great personal risk. That was everything. The friendship, brothers from different sides. After their reunion, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became close friends despite living in different countries. They visited each other regularly, attended air shows and veterans reunions together, and were frequently interviewed about their encounter. They appeared on television programs, were featured in newspaper articles, and spoke at military history conferences. Their friendship became a powerful symbol of reconciliation and the possibility of finding common humanity even with former enemies. Brown and Stigler represented something profound, that even in the midst of total war, individuals could make moral choices, that honor and mercy still existed, and that former enemies could become friends. They would often be photographed together, standing side by side, the American pilot and the German pilot, now old men, both survivors of a war that had defined their generation. In photos, they are often smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, the bond between them obvious and deep. In interviews, they emphasized that they didn't represent their nations or militaries, but rather their personal experience. Stigler was careful to note that his decision to spare the bomber was individual, not representative of German military policy. Brown emphasized that most German pilots would have shot down the bomber without hesitation. Their encounter was exceptional precisely because it was so unusual. But their friendship also sparked controversy. Some German veterans criticized Stigler for betraying his country by aiding the enemy. Some American veterans questioned why Brown was celebrating a German pilot who had killed Allied airmen in combat. Both men received hate mail from people who couldn't forgive former enemies or accept that compassion could exist in wartime. Brown and Stigler ignored the criticism. They had found something rare, a connection forged in the most extreme circumstances, a debt acknowledged and accepted, a mutual respect born from shared experience that transcended nationality and former enmity. Their friendship was proof that individuals could resist dehumanization even when their governments and militaries demanded it. In 2008, their story was documented in the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos and Larry Alexander. The book became a bestseller, bringing their encounter to a wider audience and ensuring the story would be preserved for future generations. The book detailed not just their encounter, but their entire wartime experiences and the long search that eventually reunited them. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at age 92. His funeral was attended by Charlie Brown, who traveled to Canada to say goodbye to the man who had saved his life 65 years earlier. Brown gave a eulogy, praising Stigler's courage, character, and the decision that had given 10 American airmen their futures. Charlie Brown died on November 24, 2008, just 8 months after Stigler, at age 87. Their families had become close over the years, and Stigler's family attended Brown's funeral. The two men had been reunited for 18 years after 47 years apart, a relatively brief time, but enough to express gratitude, to build genuine friendship, and to tell the world their extraordinary story.